The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, which you've given us in our Savior Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen.
Amen.
Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed week one. Right, this gives you a good idea. Now, reminder, you may have said, hey, we didn't read any of 1 Corinthians, but you could have. you could have given the glance. What he's going to do, right, the first 2 weeks is set some context, right? And we read a little bit of Mark, and we read a little bit of Acts, and a little bit of Luke. And then we got some pages on Corinth and the backdrop. You're going to get something a little bit like that next week. And then in week 3, we'll start going right through 1 Corinthians. So there's a lot of ramp up here, but hopefully helpful. I always want to start out really soft, and say, from the pages that he gave us, before we answer his questions, which is always what we really want to do as the main experience, right? Did you have questions or comments or reactions to the pages, A Different World, that we read? It's not a good question. I know that. I'm just trying to make it soft and open.
Greeks taken intellectual thought to a very high level. So numerous philosophy out there. According to Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, the whole school of thought. Really, unless they have found influence on Christian subjects. Pretty advanced on what they're doing. That was very important.
This is probably very. But, in the reading, I kind of can't tell the difference between a plebeian and a slave.
Yeah, okay. So just think about the difference between somebody who is essentially owned by somebody else and somebody who's like a sharecropper.
Okay.
Yeah, like between a peasant, they both are living hand to mouth. But if you're a slave, you essentially have somebody feeding you. So you actually, it's a strange thing. This is different kind of slavery from African slavery in the United States. A slave system has patronage as well. So it could be better depending on the area and who your particular owner or patron is, to have that system than to have nothing. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. That's not a silly, by the way, there's not silly questions. We're all coming from different experiences. We're all doing that. And so silly questions are ones that you don't really want to learn from. Yeah.
Yeah, just a huge percentage of the population were slaves. It's very interesting. You have that. Yeah, and how would they allow that up? So you think, well, maybe they just more tolerant with the gifts that they got from the master or something, or food. But and how did they distribute the slaves? How was it great without conquered nations? How did he bring all these slaves back? Okay, you can sick. Yeah, but how did they do that? I don't know.
Yeah, and so it's helpful to think in the ancient world, there's different kinds of slavery. And we don't like that word, particularly in the States, for really good reasons, right? But the first kind, that's like the oldest kind of slavery on the planet, seems to be prisoners of war. So if I beat you, I can now take you back, and you kind of can do whatever I tell you, because we don't have a common language likely. You've been beaten, so I've sort of proven superiority over you. And that seems to be real old, like humans have been doing that a long time, this kind of prisoner of war slavery. Then, the word slavery gets used as an sort of an umbrella term. So those people are like theoretically property. And if you read through the Torah, there's sort of different rules if I kill you than if I kill your slave. If I kill your slave, I have to recompense you money. If I kill you, I die. So it is a different level, right? Then the word slave can also mean somebody who's indebted. So that's like we don't usually think like, oh, if you've got major credit card debt, that's a form of financial slavery. But when you read that word in the Bible, that could be the kind of slavery that they're talking about, right? So this would be kind of like being an indentured servant, which has how a lot of people got here. The word slavery in the ancient Near Eastern context could include indentured servants, not physical property, right? So this could be bigger. And part of what he said in the reading too is that slaves could buy their freedom. That was a thing. And slaves could actually get out of slavery by getting a new master, which is the Roman military. So in some ways, slave is a misleading term for us because I'm not saying slavery is okay, and I'm saying it's not great. We figured this out, right? But probably a better word that we could use as an umbrella would be like a patronage system, where somebody's wealthy and you're relying on them hand to mouth for your education until you can have some kind of opportunity. And you can really get into the weeds. Like if you wanted to be a senator, you could not have been a slave. If you wanted to be a member of the equestrian class, you could not have been a slave. If you're a slave, the highest you're going to get is the rank of centurion, which is like chief master sergeant, which is good. Like if you've been in the military, right, an E8 is running the base. We know the colonel and the general are, but the E8 is running the base. The centurion is running the army, but they're not a noble, and they can't be. That's reserved for the equestrian and senator. And so then as now, there's ways you express that through clothing, and you probably know purple clothing. Purple, you can't wear purple if you've been a slave. First of all, you wouldn't even be able to afford it. But if you did somehow, and you wore it, you'd be impersonating an officer, and you could have awful punishment for that. So very stratified society, but not always one-to-one from like from the American South context. I don't know if that's helpful at all.
How are they in the ministry? How are they? I mean, I assume the effort mentioning whatever that's who's hearing from Paul, from the readings. But
Yeah,
it's how do you get down through the.
So actually, it seems like the initial growth in the Christian community seemed to be the poorest and the richest. And middle class was relatively small, but like some of the oldest church gatherings were in the catacombs in Rome, where a family of 4 would live in like 20 square feet. That's kind of wild to think about, isn't it? And the way they would have church is they would like open up the sheets between 5 or 6 of those 20 square foot homes, so that all the homes would be open. And you will also read, like in Philippi, that there's this lady Lydia who's fabulously wealthy. She's a purple merchant, and she holds church at her house. And it's good to remember there's no public buildings, none. Churches met in homes. Christianity was against the law. So you met in homes, and we wouldn't even use the word Christianity when this is being written. When Paul writes, the earliest followers of Jesus are called the Way. Christian doesn't show up as a term historically till like the 90s of the Common Era. So earliest followers call themselves the Way, and they're not totally sure, is this a reform movement in Judaism? Is it its own thing? And that tension builds. Jewish people say, no, it's its own thing. Christian people say, no, we're Reformed Judaism. And part of the reason why you read in here, Judaism was tolerated in the Roman Empire because it was antiquated. the author said people thought it was foolish. That's a little bit over the top. It's a very old religion. So even though Jewish people didn't sacrifice to the emperor because of their antiquity, in the religious world, newer is not better. Right? New age is a phrase we use diminutively, right? And old tradition is kind of what you want. So Jewish people were able to be monotheists and be tolerated, but if Christianity is a new religion, it won't be tolerated. And that's some of the rub between people who follow the way and people who consider themselves Jewish, not followers of Jesus. And that escalates when there's a Jewish rebellion.
Isn't there a Jews for Jesus church?
There
Or is that a
is.
real church?
Yeah, no, there's people who do that. And
I just wondered, it's like they're on the fence.
I just, look, there's Judaism and then there's not Judaism. So just be one or the other, like it's okay, it's all right. Yeah, Seventh-day Adventists are actually surprisingly keep to a lot of Hebrew customs. They do, right? That's why they worship on Saturdays, and they essentially keep the kosher diet. And they don't call themselves Messianic Jews, they call them Seventh-day Adventists, and that's an old faith. Like historically, that's been around a long time. Yeah, it's actually kind of offensive to our Jewish brothers and sisters to say I'm a Messianic Jew. Like that's just confusing to the Jewish ear. Sorry. Are we ready to jump into his questions?
Yeah.
And I did want to mention, I hope you noticed in the reading, it's not like there was a Greek context. One, there's like all kinds of stuff going on, right? There's Gnostics maybe, and there's Neoplatonists, and there's Platonists, and there's people who worship Zeus, and there's the mystery religions, and you could actually double dip in several of those. You could. Or you could say, I'm just doing it this way, and that's fine, right? But like, what did the average Corinthian think? Which one? What's the average American think? And which neighborhood do they live in? What do they look like? This is like a really important thing we have to put before us, right? This is a real cosmopolitan mishmash city, like New York City. Anything goes in Corinth. Like you'll find somebody that thinks like you. Okay, so in what ways do you think, from what you read, or from what you know already, is the Greco-Roman culture like and unlike our contemporary setting? That's a really important question as we start thinking about how are we going to process what we're going to read, and how are we going to apply it and decode it?
Wasn't it very diverse like ours? People that had all kinds of different things. I mean, you can go to Christian churches and they're different depending on the basis of, whatever ancient religion the people had, and I think that's kind of cool. It kind of, some people don't. Some people think it's watering down the Christianity, but I mean, that's the world we live in, And so, because the people from Europe came over here and converted people to Christianity, and a lot of people kept some of their original things, and it kind of flavors it. And I think it's in a nice way, but, so I kind of envision it like that.
Multicultural city, right? And Houston is the most diverse city in the United States. This is true, right?
Yeah, and different flavors,
Yeah, all the isms.
How many of you personally know somebody who practices the religion called Sikhism or Sikh? How many know somebody who know somebody, not of them, know somebody who is a member of the Baha'i faith?
I know somebody who knows somebody.
How many of you know somebody who practices the Zoroastrian faith? How many of you know somebody who is a Shiite Muslim, not a Sunnite, but Shiite? So I just want you to look at how not diverse we are in the room. Is that okay that I said that?
Yes.
So we live in a super multicultural city. We do. We also live in a suburb that's not actually super tolerant of diversity. And if you don't mind me saying, this neighborhood is very not tolerant of diversity among homeowners. Among apartment dwellers, yes. In the homeowners in this neighborhood that I live in, not diverse. So we find ourselves in this tension, which I think probably relates.
Yeah.
Right? Not contradicting. I think it's there. The question is, are we aware of it? Do we cultivate it, or do we get kind of worried about it? And I think that's a Corinthian problem. As we're going to read, that's a Corinthian problem.
I have a question. So it talks about all these like intellectual spirits, like this neo-Pythagorean, and like, the average people, like obviously these are the people that broke down stuff. Yeah, did the average people, were they probably more apathetic? Or do we not know what they thought?
We
Or is
don't
this, like,
know.
pretty much we think this influenced everyday people?
It's so hard to know, right? Because when the literacy rate is 5%, the writing you get to read is from 5% of the population. And those 5% are the ones who have the luxury of getting letters. But in general, if you were literate in the ancient world, you also didn't have to do all that much. Right? So what we get essentially is like the viewpoint of people who knew how to read or write, who probably had like some social standing and had enough learning to be literate. And we don't know how representative any viewpoint is that way.
We also don't know, like, often these authors in the Bible, also were not literate, and they spoke what they wanted to say, someone else wrote it down.
Yeah.
So interpretation of exactly what they said, we may never know either.
Yeah, and so this is where we sort of say, well, what do we do with what we got? Which has always been good enough for us. It has. It's always been good enough for us. And I don't know, Casey, to your question, like again, we don't know what does the average person think. One of the things we do know is that Judaism was a very attractive religion in the Greco-Roman world. There were a couple of reasons people didn't want to do it, which had to do with adult male circumcision. And it's not because of just the pain. It's not just that. Like that's one thing. But look, anybody can do something for a couple of hours, just bottom line, right? The real issue is when you do that, you're now physically marked as sort of anti-socialist, as in doing a behavior that is against the grain of normal society. And you can't really hide that. Because in your larger culture, like there's public baths, men are visibly physically naked. So it's not just, oh, I don't want to do the pain. It's I might lose my livelihood if I do that. And there's really no going back. So when you read Acts, Paul goes to synagogues and he's not successful with Jewish people, not very. He's successful with the Gentiles standing outside of the synagogue, listening, because they really want that, but they don't want to lose their livelihood. What do they want? They want an everyday ethic, because if you were a follower of, say, Zeus or Aphrodite or Mars, right, what we call popular Greek religion, your religion consisted of offering sacrifices on festal days. That's about it. I mean, think about the Greek god stories you know. I would whip my kids if they acted like the deities. They're not moral exemplars at all. And Greek philosophers call them out on that, right? Like Plato says, this is all crazy because like they're worse than human beings, right? So people actually wanted an ethic. They wanted an ethic and they wanted a community, right? They did. And that was Judaism offered that. That was real attractive to folks. But again, you know, like when you're going to lose your livelihood, right? Like, yeah, and you're going to be socially ostracized, that's a big ask. So maybe you can kind of keep your foreskin and listen to the philosophy of the religion, right? And there's a difference between a philosophy, right, and then sort of a belief system. Those actually can be kind of different. So you can have like the ethical philosophy and without doing the other.
Why are we still doing this?
What do you mean?
Why are we still having some? I mean, I have a nephew whose son, all his kids have it, and it's a horrible thing to go through.
I mean, my family does that. We did,
Culture now, it's not religious.
it's part of our culture. It's, there's places that are undoing it. I mean, I think during World War II and like even Vietnam, like there was a sanitation issue, but we
Yeah.
figured ourselves out about that. We know what to do with that. So I think it's a cultural thing. What's interesting, having just been to South Africa, if you're born Xhosa or if you're born like Zulu, you're doing that when you're 16.
16.
Yeah. And it's still, this is how they've been doing it for thousands of years. And they don't want to change that. Like our guide was Xhosa and that was his lot in life. And he was like, it's terrible sometimes because people don't do it with clean knives.
Mm.
And like you can get AIDS and you can get an infection and die, but he's like, there's no reason to do that. The government will pay for you to have somebody who knows how to do this. It was really clear to me. He was doing that for his son. That was what they were going to do. Nelson Mandela did that, right? Like that's a thing that you do. It's a rite of passage. It's when you become an adult in that culture. So, I don't know how to answer your question.
Okay, that's just.
The truth is rites of passage and cultural identity don't just fall down into logic. They fall into like, this is what it means to be one of us.
And in our culture, it's babies. They don't wait
Oh,
for
no.
the man. It's a baby,
I know, I mean,
which is kind of random.
You got two boys. Mm-hmm. They're both snipped. They're both snipped. Yep, they're snipped right out the womb in the hospital.
Yeah, and it's by a doctor, it's not by a rabbi. If you're Jewish, it's not a doctor doing it. And it's not a rabbi, it's somebody cut a mohel. And you're gonna have your family there for that. Like, it's not gonna happen while you're gone. Like, that's a thing. And it happens on the 8th day. Like, that's a big thing.
It's a
Right.
ritual.
It's a ritual. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Like a bar mitzvah.
It's
Yes.
a bris. It's
Say again.
a bris, is that what they call
A what?
A
Bris.
bris.
it? BRIS, this ceremony?
Yeah, that's right. Happens on the 8th day. Usually happens in your home unless you have to do it in a hospital because you're born premature, but it has to happen 8 days in.
After birth.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
By a rabbi.
It's like a party.
For everybody except for the baby.
That's why I got girls.
Yeah, there's a lot of different rules. Yeah. I mean, look, it depends on what the hospital will do, but like, look, if you're Jewish, like that's critical. Yeah, and we all do that different. Like if like you probably know this from nursing, if a Jewish patient dies, they're not going to the morgue. The undertaker's coming to get them because they can't go to the morgue. And if the hospital puts them in the morgue, that's a big problem. Like religiously, that's sacrilegious to them, right? And they can't go into a place with other dead bodies, and they've got 24 hours to get buried. So yeah, that's real inconvenient. And if you're Jewish, like that's just what you're gonna do. And like I can get it, and it like, hey, it doesn't always work that way. But again, we get this. Our ways of life are not always linear. They're not always linear. Yeah.
Because in Bahamas, when you have a child 6 weeks, that baby getting baptized.
Yeah. And there's a big thing not here that is like, so it's like this big tension between Roman and Greece. And you're going to see it later in 1 Corinthians, we talk about culture. There's like mentorships that happen in ancient Greece between elder men and younger men. But those aren't just like, let me teach you how to do the business. They also have to do with like physical mentorships. And the Romans were critical of this practice. They call it pederasty, which is essentially an adult. It's not always penetration, but it is physical and sexual between an adult and a younger male who has like the ideal young male body, but the older person has the position of power and the wisdom. And so this is going on. And actually, when you read the vice list, if you've read 1 Corinthians, this happens in like chapter 11, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, there can't be this. And one of the words that gets translated as homosexuals, it's likely means the practice I just described instead. Or it means same-sex prostitution, not equal people making consensual decision. I don't know if that makes sense. And I don't know if it's helpful to hear prostitution wasn't like Amsterdam where you pay somebody out of their own house. It was ritualized and religious. So visiting prostitutes was like going to a prayer meeting.
Kind of like in Japan.
Yeah.
Where it's a geisha, it's like that, it's kind of almost spiritual.
A lot of us didn't get this, but there's this idea of the sacred marriage. It's an old archetypal idea where if two people on earth copulate, that encourages the deities in heaven to copulate, and that's like where rain comes from and replenishes the earth. So you may say that's crazy, right? And we don't live in that belief system, but you just need to know prostitution in the ancient world was highly ritualized, not just transactional. Like prostitutes were in temples, not in bordellos. Which is why it shows up so much in Paul's writing. It's not just literal prostitution. He's talking about this analogically, right? Analogically and sacredly. Like don't combine a prostitute with the Lord. Doesn't just mean physically. It means this kind of spiritual union. And essentially it means don't bring in traditions that are going to change this good news. What else do you guys have thoughts about? Sorry, I just got going. I'm sorry.
Back to your comment, our discussion earlier, when we were talking about Greek gods and religion and philosophy. I have the impression, maybe you can correct me, that the Greeks believed in these gods, but that wasn't necessarily a highly structured religion.
Yeah.
In fact, it was very loose. Where they got structure and ethics was from their philosophy.
Yeah, and belief is real different, right? So we put a premium on belief since the Reformation, particularly. Like we've got the creeds, and we've got like 5 points of fundamentalism, and 5 points of Calvinism. It's really important. In the ancient world, like you do your duty, belief is not a premium. So like I know this is going to sound really strange. Like if you ask the average, it seems like if you ask the average person, like, do you believe Zeus is the king of heaven? It's like, I offered a sacrifice yesterday, would be the reply. I don't know if that makes sense. It's like what do you practice would be the bigger question than like, what are your tenets of faith?
And one view of Gnosticism, and there are many, lots of people put that term on themselves, is that Gnostics have a premium for, they have secret knowledge, or they have knowledge, and that's more important than the faith. So you can see why with their faith wisdom and all, they really could be the Gnostics there.
There's if you want an interesting book, I actually just finished this book. Sort of offers a different view of Gnosticism. It's called The Wisdom Jesus. And the book claims, I think it's worth thinking through, that we kind of have given Gnosticism, like we've made Gnosticism a caricature, that Gnosticism is about secret knowledge, but the internal documents talk about it being part of this wisdom tradition, which, yeah, but not knowledge as we normally think of as fact pattern, really more about like, transformation. I don't want to say transcendence, but something like between transformation and transcendence. So not like I know a spell book, but rather like there's a different way of fundamentally being than I've settled for. That's an interesting book. It's on Audible. It's free, actually. Yes, sir.
So reading this about like Platonism or whatever, I could kind of see it when I get through, like, because I guess he's talking about the spiritual man and the physical man.
Yeah.
And also that's kind of like a Gnostic thing, right, too, right?
Yeah, and one way that we caricature that is saying, right, and I hope this is really clear. The Jewish tradition has never said physicality is bad. Never. That actually came from Manichaeanism, which Augustine was a Manichae, which is like super heretical, it turns out, right? Which is like spirit good, body bad, good spirit imprisoned in bad body. And I want to be really clear, that's not biblical at all, not. So if we project that on these words, it's really easy to do that when you read Paul, because it talks about a spiritual person and a physical person. Paul's not doing the Manichaean thing that the spirit is superior and the body's inferior. He's not doing that. He's trying to say that there's a unity of living, and when we only live in one part or the other, we're missing the unity of living. I think.
Yeah.
And so do the folks I've read.
So would you see a duality between the spirit and the physical? Or is that something that you probably, because he's been introduced to Platonism and what the Greek was?
I don't think because Paul bought that argument. I mean, Paul's Jewish, and you'll read in 1 Thessalonians, they don't believe in a general resurrection. They believe in a resurrection of the body. So we don't think that, to be really clear. I don't know anybody that thinks you get your body back when you die, like it is now.
That's a good thing.
Right, and most people, and if I asked you what body you want, you probably don't want the one you got right now. Like maybe I'd take Brad Pitt's 30 years ago, or I'd, like this is the kind of games we play. But if you're Jewish, right, it's all physical. The stuff is actually really, really good. We've done this thing because we've been influenced by that tradition. Manichaeism is not in the New Testament. That's 300 years later. And we're reading that retroactively. Body good, spirit good, body and spirit good together. So I'm going to suggest that Paul is actually saying when we privilege one over the other, we're making a mistake. So that the physical person who's only thinking physically is not even at home within themselves. And somebody who lives abstractly and is not embodied is actually not any better off. Because like part of the message we have, the key Christian message is Jesus wasn't the spirit. He was embodied. We forget that a lot. We forget that a lot as contemporary Christians. Like Jesus was embodied, which means the body is just fine. It's good. And body urges, or we think bodies are gross. That's cultural. That's not theological. Like God designed us to poop, and like I don't know why, but that was God's idea, right? And so, like I may think it's inconvenient and gross, but like God designed that, so it's not like a bad thing to do.
So even Jesus pooped.
I mean, he wouldn't have made it 33 years if he had it, right? Like this is, I don't want to be too tongue in cheek, but this is really helpful to think through, right? And I think this goes along with the question actually, because like, look, I don't know how you grew up, but like, embodiment's weird. I think, I mean, I'm just gonna say the way I grew up and the church that raised me, we're not real at peace with embodiment. And particularly with sexuality, that's gonna show up a lot in this book, sexuality. And in general, kind of what I got is sexuality is great, but not most of the time. Like that's what the church kind of taught me. And like, it's great when you're married, but like there was no description of how that would be, just that it would. And let me tell you, as a married person, there wasn't a magic spell, right? Like that's the thing. We continue to figure that out. Like I'm not going to say I figured that out once, because our bodies are still changing, right? We continue to figure that out. And sure, it can be hurtful. It can be disappointing. It can be a lot of work. Look, I don't think I'm preaching to somebody who doesn't know this, right? Like it can, and it can be so unitive and fantastic, right? And it's not one or the other magically. It takes work. And part of our heritage that is not here, right, is we were founded by the Puritans, who were very, very, very not sexually affirming, not very concerned about sexuality more than anything. Okay, so in general, when we read this letter in the West, we got to be aware of how we're reading, because in Corinthians, they weren't in Corinth, they weren't worried about that. And Paul's trying to rein them in a little bit, right, and say, let's just be thoughtful and careful about what we do. Not because there's rules, because there's consequences when we're not thoughtful and careful. The body represents the spirit represents the body, right? So we don't just do physical things that don't have spiritual consequences. I think that's what he's trying to offer us. I'm talking way too much.
You do see the Greeks, like I think we are a little bit. We often talk about body, soul, and spirit.
Mm.
Okay, but I don't think we know what we're talking about. I know I don't.
Yeah.
And the Greeks, the Stoics believed in an immortal soul. But the other Greek, like
Epicureans.
Didn't believe in that at all. Think what you got is all you're gonna have.
And Jewish people did not believe in this at the time. And still many Jewish people don't believe in that. And this is really good to hear. We often use words in a totally different way. So this is going to be true in 1 Corinthians. Your heart is the center of your will in the Bible. The center of your will. Now you tell me, where's the center of your will? I think most of us are going to point here, right? In the Bible, the center of your emotions are your bowels. Like I feel butterflies in my stomach, right? That's where my feelings live, is in my bowels. We've made the switcheroo, right? This is where I feel stuff. This is where I think stuff. And most of us grew up that your soul is here and that your soul is distinct from your body. But at least in the Hebrew mind, you don't have a soul, you are a soul. Like your soul is the amalgam of all your parts. Your body, your psychology, your spirituality, your emotions, all of that makes you a soul. A soul is not distinct from the other bits. It's all of them combined. So when you hear, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, and all your soul, that's not how it reads in Hebrew. With all your heart, with all your soul, and with everything after that, which by the way, there's nothing. There's nothing after that. So sometimes we've redone the terms a bit, right? And that separation of soul and body, that's not organic to the letter. That's retroactively reading that in.
When folks say stuff like you gotta worry about your soul,
I hope you do worry about your soul. I hope you take good care of the body you got. That's worrying about your soul. I hope you take good care of your mental state. That's worrying about your soul. I hope you pray and you love and you give, and that's taking care of your soul, right? But sometimes we've heard take care of your soul means you can treat your body harshly, right? I'm gonna help my soul by hurting my body. Not biblical. It doesn't mean it's wrong, it's just not biblical. In the Bible, if I hurt my body, I've hurt my soul, because that's part of it.
Now, I understand that Jewish view that the soul is kind of a combination of the spirit and the body, if you will, like the whole thing, the whole being. But in Christianity, how do we look at those three?
Well, we've kind of normatively split them out a little bit. So we have to decide, do we want to stay where we are? Do we want to go back to the ancient tradition, or do we want to have a dialogue? I like the dialogue bit, I do, because like the church that raised me, it was okay if you took terrible care of your body because you were going to heaven when you died. And I just don't think God's into that. I mean, I just don't think that's right. I don't want to be obsessive about it, but you know, like God gave us the body to treat it well, right?
What gets resurrected?
Say again?
What gets resurrected?
Well, when you read 1 Thessalonians, your body does.
you see,
Sometimes you see that. And then sometimes you see it kind of just soul. I don't know.
That's because, and let's not be afraid of this, okay? This can sound scary, because once I say this, you may say, then how do we know what's right? But look, every religious tradition that's still alive, everyone that's a living religion, has to change as we update. Because there's new technology, there's new interactions with different cultures, right? Like, I didn't read anything here about in vitro fertilization, because they didn't do that. We figured that out like a couple decades ago. And so we got to figure out, what do we do about that, right? And most of us have figured out that seems like that's fine, right? Like that's okay, like that's gonna work. In vitro fertilization, it's not in the Bible because they didn't have the technology, right? So we've got new technology. Surrogacy was okay, but we've got that. So now we figure out, what does it mean to do it as a Christian person? And like if you were here on Wednesday morning, does anybody use a rosary before?
yeah,
And the rosary, right, came from Muslims. Crusaders saw Muslims with a string of beads, counting the 99 names of Allah, and they said, I want that. So they put a cross on it. I mean, that's where it came from. And well, we could say they corrupted a pagan thing, right? Well, the Muslims got it from the Buddhists, and the Buddhists got it from the Hindus. And when you do that, it's called syncretism. If you meet a different way of life or philosophy or theology, it's different from yours, and you think there's something to that. So how can I like put it in my worldview in a good way and still enjoy what I saw those other people enjoying, right? We've been doing that a long time. And resurrection, the whole idea of a resurrection is syncretistic. When you read the Hebrew Bible, there's not one. There's not one. The idea came, we think, from Zoroastrians, and Jewish people ran into those in the exile in Babylon, and they said that, let's see, that makes sense, right? Because look, we all get it. You could be really corrupt on earth and you can still be wealthy. It doesn't seem fair. So look, the resurrection's a solution to that. It'll get leveled out later. And the earliest idea of the resurrection, like when Paul's writing, is not probably the one we have with harps and wings, and you go to heaven and sing songs for a long time. It's in fact like if you die prematurely for your faith, particularly like if you get martyred or you get killed, you lost the chance to live your life. So you get your life back. This idea really came out, we think, when during the Jewish rebellion against the Greek king Antiochus Epiphanes. You can read about this in 1st and 2nd Maccabees in your Apocrypha if you want to, where the king basically said, if you circumcise your baby, you have to wear it dead around your neck until we kill you, if you're a mom. If you're a man and you have a piece of the Torah, like a scrap, they'll burn it with you at the stake. So people were dying so that they could have the Torah. And people were dying so they could circumcise their babies, right? Women were dying for that. So the theology came out. If that happens to you, you'll get your life back. Like you'll get to live your life. That seems to be the earliest idea of resurrection. Like it was cut short, but you get it back. Then it became more generalized. Everybody gets it. And then we've had to make decisions. Is there purgatory? Is there Hades? Is there hell? Does everybody go to heaven? And just to be honest, that's evolved over time. It has. Like the documents point to it evolving. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means we've been changing, we've been figuring it out. I hope that makes sense what I'm saying.
Yeah, during the plague in Europe, so many people were depressed because they lost so many family members, so they would take their own life. And the Catholic Church said that was an unforgivable sin. And that was not, in the Bible, it doesn't say anything about it being an unforgivable sin. And I don't think that thought is in place today, but I know it wasn't.
It is for some people.
But
It is.
my father took his life when he was 45, and I was told by so many people that he has no chance. He's in heaven. And I wouldn't know what to say, and I'd get angry, and I wouldn't say anything. I'd get tongue-tied. And finally, I got to where I said, if that's true, I'm going to go down there willingly and happily and bring a cold washcloth and put it on his head. I'm not afraid. I'm going to do that because I was very close with my dad. And when I said that sort of thing, people would just walk away. They wouldn't argue.
Well,
I got them to be quiet about it.
and thank you, because that's a great example of something I think all of us are figuring out right now. And maybe you haven't made this conversion plan. I'm not judging you, right? If you haven't, it's okay. But like women being in ministry. I know this sounds really silly, because most of us have like hopped over this one in some ways, right? I mean, like one of my first priests was female, and people would call her a priestess to diminish her, and they would come to the rail and refuse to take communion from her as an act of protest. And look,
Well, then don't come.
I know, but they were trying to make a point. They were trying to say how wrong it was. And look, like I sit there and I'm horrified. And look, it took that for us to figure it out a little bit. If you don't mind me saying. And we're still, let's not pretend like we figured it all out. We're still figuring that stuff out.
Yeah, and didn't Paul say, I listened to Corinthians, thank you, by the way, because I'd never listened to someone talk, and it was amazing. It was this really cool sounding British guy. It was, Paul, and I just imagined, he just became Paul. And I've read Corinthians before, and this was a totally different
like, it soaked in when I heard this man talking like Paul. And he said women are not allowed to talk in the church. Because man came from God, not women. Women came from man, so they have to be silent and they can't cut their hair. And I was just kind of like, oh, wow.
Too late
And
for
I'm
me
so
then.
glad you read that, right? Because let's consider, right, in 1 Corinthians 12, Paul says, doesn't nature itself put a man to shame to have long hair?
Yeah, I said that.
Doesn't nature itself? It's unnatural, like against the rules of nature for men to have long hair. If you don't cut hair, it grows. I mean, that's natural.
With all the pictures of Jesus, he has long hair.
Yeah.
I've never seen.
Or woolly hair. It's not all long.
Yeah.
All the pictures aren't straight and blonde and whatnot.
I'm not trying to introduce tension, but I want to say that's tension we need to be aware of when we read this, right? Sorry, I'm probably talking too long, but the second question I think is really interesting. How does multiculturalism, religious pluralism, philosophical diversity, and competing moralities contribute to discord and unity in the church today? That's a real important question. I don't know that. Yeah.
You said earlier, they get their life back. Is that a form of?
No. So like, imagine you're like 25 and you just got burned alive, or you're 25 and you got your head chopped off. Like God puts your head back on and you get to live the rest of your life. Physically, you get the rest of your life. The notion of eternity isn't a Hebrew idea. It's just not a Hebrew idea. It's not Hebrew.
They just said that happened.
Not really, that's what I.
That's a good question. I don't know how to answer that. I don't know how to answer that. We don't,
That makes you honest.
yeah, I mean, we don't have like documentary, so
Chopped off and didn't get them put back on.
I-
people
I
and
mean,
start questioning.
when you read what Paul says, though, the resurrection doesn't happen in tears. It happens all at one time. And actually, we have this idea, and there's nothing wrong with the idea. We have the idea, like, when you die, like, my dad died, my dad went to heaven. Like, that's our idea. It's not biblical at all. It's not. Read the book of Revelation. The saints are waiting to go in because in the eyes of the apocalypticist of Revelation, no one goes ahead of anybody else. We all go at once. And you may say, well, that's really a quality of resurrection, not like how it works. But I just want to make sure we're clear. We've strayed from that. We've strayed from that with what we say and what we normally think. It doesn't mean we're wrong. Doesn't mean we're competing. I think the view in Revelation is in the next thing, everybody's the same. And nobody got there first because we all go together. That can both be qualitatively true and not how it works. I don't know. Does that make sense what I'm saying? When Paul talks about it in 1 Thessalonians, which we think is the oldest part of the New Testament, like the oldest writing piece, the dead get raised first, and then everybody who's alive joins. So the dead aren't raised yet. And you know that because you don't see their bodies walking around. You don't see their bodies. So that body thing's going to happen later.
I'm totally confused.
And one possible explanation to your question is the Jews were persecuted for millennia. So the idea is spread, well, maybe you can have a better life later. It was probably very appealing.
I think it also appeals to, frankly, our sense of justice, right? So if you believe in reincarnation, you've got your justice system built in. Like, life's not fair now, but it'll work itself out in your next 3 iterations, right? But because the Judeo tradition doesn't buy that, then so you don't get multiple iterations, but you do get one more. But that didn't happen in the Hebrew Bible. Like, if you read the book of Job, Job's really clear. Everybody goes to the grave with a capital G. It's called Sheol. Everyone goes to the pit with a capital P. Kings, paupers, good people, bad people, you just all go to the grave. And what's that like? It's real dark and it's under the ground. So I'm not saying the scriptures are wrong. I'm saying our approach to scripture has changed as we've abutted against different traditions, right? And again, you ask a Jewish person today, 99.5 Jewish people out of 100 will tell you there's no hell. And the 0.5% who say that there is one, there's like 3 people going there and that's it. So Jewish people just don't buy hell, they don't. And the rabbi made that real clear. If God's loving, how would God punish you forever? What about Hitler? What Jewish people say is like, if you don't make it, then you just cease to exist. But you don't get tortured forever. So there's different ways our Jewish brothers and sisters do this. And that's actually the older way of thinking. So we've moved on from that a bit in the Christian church. It doesn't mean they're right and they're wrong. I just want to be clear. The scriptures are written with the older mentality being worked out still.
Got a question. So I've been seeing a lot of my assumptions, which very interestingly have been not true, finding out. So I've always had this assumption, or I kind of did from reading the Bible, that so Jesus was kind of in the backwater, right? And Paul mentioned, he's like, I'm a Roman citizen, you know, you got to teach me to the. So was Paul more plugged into this greater Mediterranean culture that he would be more influenced by these different strands of thoughts than Jesus probably?
This is so hard to know because this book, The Wisdom of Jesus I just read, makes this really interesting point, which is Capernaum's on the Silk Road.
Yeah,
So the Silk Road is where people from India and Persia are passing through to Rome. So Capernaum might actually be better situated for a global perspective than Jerusalem.
yeah.
So we kind of don't know. That's the interesting part. We don't know. What we know about Paul being a Roman citizen is at the time, citizenship wasn't just available to anybody. You had to buy it or be born into it, and it was the privilege of a select few. So Paul's a Jewish Roman citizen. Yeah, that's possible. Probably somebody in the family a couple years back bought into it, like paid the government for the right of citizenship. Citizens have rights not everybody has.
Yeah. And also the fact I noticed he can kind of go anywhere and be like, talk to him, and they're like, okay, this guy's all right. Whereas if he was just, like just fell off the turnip.
A bumpkin.
Yeah,
Right. Yeah. So again, this is a little bit interesting. I don't know if the wisdom of Jesus is right, but it's an interesting thought about maybe Jesus actually had a little more cosmopolitan than we normally give him. And to your point, like, yeah, so if Paul grew up in Antioch, Tarsus is near Antioch, right? That's also a center of learning, both Jewish and one of those other, the King's highways go north, south, the Silk Road goes east, west. I think multiculturalism gives us some challenges right now, if you don't mind me saying. We worry a lot about appropriation, like let's not appropriate from somebody else. We don't talk about how we respect somebody else, and that's an issue, right? And sometimes we look and somebody's different, so they're wrong. Like that still happens, or how sweet y'all do that over there. Here's how we do it. Have you ever found yourself thinking, but how we really do it is this? I might be the only one. Sometimes I see other folk in the Houston area who are doing stuff, and I haven't thought, well, that's sweet, y'all do it, but here's how we do it. And that's a problem with multiculturalism and unity and respect and diversity, right? It is.
I'm guilty
But like you saying, Christianity's changed over the millennia because of multiculturalism, and that's okay. And it has slowly, it's still changing, and it's changing from scientific discoveries that are being made, like you said, in vitro fertilization, or the fact that they can do the mathematics now to show that time is an artificial construct.
Yeah.
So maybe we all go to heaven at the same time because there is no such thing as time. It's all,
Isn't that weird?
past, present, and future really do exist right now.
Yeah. No, I mean, I yes and no, right? Because I think sometimes in the face of multiculturalism, it can be real overwhelming.
Yeah.
And destabilizing. And that can cause us to actually double down and be xenophobic instead of like open to a conversation where I don't have to be converted, but I can still listen to you.
Mhm.
And I see that, look, American politics are doing that. Is it okay if I say that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, if you say anything.
Xenophobic and divisive, and I'm not calling one side out over the other. I'm saying that's just the state of it, right? Politicians are like not listening to each other, and they're not willing to. And churches are like that too.
But you know, every challenge like that is also an opportunity.
If we would embrace it. And I think that's one of the key criteria. And when we see the Corinthians, are we gonna say, well, they're wrong, here's the right thing? Or here's an opportunity for us to really think through. We're gonna get to like the immorality chapter in 5. It's about a guy who's married his mother-in-law. And Paul says you can't do that. I want us to think about that for a second.
They married
She's
like
not a
that.
blood relation.
She's not a blood relation. She's not his mother.
Mm-mm.
She actually could be younger than he is.
Right.
Could be
true,
father's second wife.
Yeah.
Could be.
True.
And I get like it's a cultural scandal, but let's also talk about the case, not the cultural scandal when we get there, right? That's the kind of stuff Paul's trying to work out. How far is too far? Are we getting ahead of ourselves? Maybe we need to take our time instead of jumping too, maybe we'll get there, but let's take our time. I mean, these are ways we can read. We're going to get to be invited to read this. I went over time. Okay. Thank you. I hope this was fun enough. And if it's not, tell me. Say,
Oh,
let's do this a little different, please.
thought-provoking.
Yeah.
I also know it's a lot, so I'm gonna be really clear. I'm telling you things that are a little bit non-traditional, and I could be wrong. And that's okay if I'm wrong. Like the guy said, I don't have to be right. I don't. You're welcome to disagree with me openly. That's okay, because I want this to be our group. I do, and I'll learn how to talk less at some point.
Stop saying that.
Because I won't learn.